Mr. Verloc approached the imposing writing table. "The future of the proletariat. It's a society," he explained, standing ponderously by the side of the armchair. "Not anarchist in principle, but open to all shades of revolutionary opinion." "Are you in it?" "One of the vice presidents." Mr. Verloc breathed out heavily, and the first secretary of the embassy raised his head to look at him. "Then you ought to be ashamed of yourself," he said incisively. "Isn't your society capable of anything else but printing this prophetic bosh in blunt type on this filthy paper, eh? Why don't you do something? Look here. I've this matter in hand now, and I tell you plainly that you will have to earn your money. The good old Stort-Wartenheim days are over. No work, no pay." Mr. Verloc felt a queer sensation of faintness in his stout legs. He stepped back one pace and blew his nose loudly. He was in truth startled and alarmed. The rusty London sunshine, struggling clear of the London mist, shed a lukewarm brightness into the first secretary's private room, and in the silence Mr. Verloc heard against a window-pane the faint buzzing of a fly, his first fly of the year, heralding better than any number of swallows the approach of spring. The useless fussing of that tiny energetic organism affected unpleasantly this big man, threatened in his indolence. In the pause Mr. Vladimir formulated in his mind a series of disparaging remarks concerning Mr. Verloc's face and figure. The fellow was unexpectedly vulgar, heavy, and impudently unintelligent. He looked uncommonly like a master plumber come to present his bill. The first secretary of the embassy, from his occasional excursions into the field of American humour, had formed a special notion of that class of mechanic as the embodiment of fraudulent laziness and incompetency. This, then, was the famous and trusty secret agent, so secret that he was never designated otherwise but by the symbol delta in the late Baron Stort-Wartenheim's official, semi-official, and confidential correspondence. The celebrated agent Delta, whose warnings had the power to change the scheme and the dates of the royal, imperial, grand ducal journeys, and sometimes cause them to be put off altogether. This fellow? And Mr. Vladimir indulged mentally in an enormous and derisive fit of merriment, partly at his own astonishment, which he had judged naive, but mostly at the expense of the universally regretted Baron Stort-Wartenheim, his late Excellency, whom the august favour of his imperial master had imposed as ambassador upon several reluctant ministers of foreign affairs, had enjoyed in his lifetime a fame for an owlish, pessimistic gullibility. His Excellency had the social revolution on the brain. He imagined himself to be a diplomat set apart by a special dispensation to watch the end of diplomacy, and pretty nearly the end of the world, in a horrid democratic upheaval. His prophetic and doleful dispatches had been for years the joke of foreign offices. He was said to have exclaimed on his deathbed, visited by his imperial friend and master, "Unhappy Europe, thou shalt perish by the moral insanity of thy children." He was fated to be the victim of the first humbugging rascal that came along, thought Mr. Vladimir, smiling vaguely at Mr. Verloc. "You ought to venerate the memory of Baron Stort-Wartenheim," he exclaimed suddenly. The lowered physiognomy of Mr. Verloc expressed a sombre and weary annoyance. "Permit me to observe to you," he said, "that I came here because I was summoned by a peremptory letter. I have been here only twice before in the last 11 years, and certainly never at 11 in the morning. It isn't very wise to call me up like this. There is just a chance of being seen, and that would be no joke for me." Mr. Vladimir shrugged his shoulders. "It would destroy my usefulness," continued the other hotly. "That is your affair," murmured Mr. Vladimir with soft brutality. "When you cease to be useful, you shall cease to be employed. Yes? Right off. Cut short you shall." Mr. Vladimir, frowning, paused, at a loss for a significantly idiomatic expression, and instantly brightened up with a grin of beautifully white teeth. "You shall be chucked," he brought out ferociously. Once more Mr Verloc had to react with all the force of his will against that sensation of faintness running down one's legs which once upon a time had inspired some poor devil with the felicitous expression, "My heart went down into my boots." Mr Verloc, aware of the sensation, raised his head bravely. Mr Vladimir bore the look of heavy inquiry with perfect serenity. "What we want is to administer a tonic to the conference in Milan," he said airily. "Its deliberations upon international action for the suppression of political crime do not seem to get anywhere. England lags. This country is absurd with its sentimental regard for individual liberty. It is intolerable to think that all your friends have got only to come over to—" "In that way I have them all under my eye," Mr Verloc interrupted huskily. "It would be much more to the point to have them all under lock and key. England must be brought into line. The imbecile bourgeoisie of this country make themselves the accomplices of the very people whose aim it is to drive them out of their houses to starve in the ditches. And they have the political power still, if only they had the sense to use it for the preservation. I suppose you agree that the middle classes are stupid?" Mr Verloc agreed hoarsely. "They are." "Then they have no imagination. They are blinded by an idiotic vanity. What they want just now is a jolly good scare. This is the psychological moment to set your friends to work. I have had you called here to develop to you my idea." And Mr Vladimir developed his idea from on high, with scorn and condescension, displaying at the same time an amount of ignorance as to the real aims, thoughts, and methods of the revolutionary world, which filled the silent Mr Verloc with inward consternation. He confounded causes with effects more than was excusable. The most distinguished propagandist with impulsive bomb-throwers assumed organization where, in the nature of things, it could not exist, spoke of the Social Revolutionary Party one moment as of a perfectly disciplined army, where the word of chiefs was supreme, and at another as if it had been the loosest association of desperate brigands that ever camped in a mountain gorge. Once Mr Verloc had opened his mouth for a protest, but the raising of a shapely, large white hand arrested him. Very soon he became too appalled to even try to protest. He listened in a stillness of dread which resembled the immobility of profound attention. "A series of outrages," Mr Vladimir continued calmly, "executed here in this country. Not only planned here, that would not do. They would not mind. Your friends could set half the continent on fire without influencing the public opinion here in favor of a universally repressive legislation. They will not look outside their backyard here." Mr Verloc cleared his throat, but his heart failed him, and he said nothing. "These outrages need not be especially sanguinary," Mr Vladimir went on, as if delivering a scientific lecture, "but they must be sufficiently startling, effective. Let them be directed against buildings, for instance. What is the fetish of the hour that all the bourgeoisie recognize, Mr Verloc?" Mr Verloc opened his hands and shrugged his shoulders slightly. "You are too lazy, I think," was Mr Vladimir's comment upon that gesture. "Pay attention to what I say. The fetish of today is neither royalty nor religion. Therefore the palace and the church should be left alone. You understand what I mean, Mr Verloc?" The dismay and the scorn of Mr Verloc found vent in an attempt at levity. "Perfectly. But what of the embassies? A series of attacks on the various embassies," he began, but he could not withstand the cold, watchful stare of the First Secretary. "You can be facetious, I see," the latter observed carelessly. "That is all right. It may enliven your oratory at socialist congresses. But this room is no place for it. It would be infinitely safer for you to follow carefully what I am saying. As you are being called upon to furnish facts instead of cock and bull stories, you had better try to make your profit off what I am taking the trouble to explain to you. The sacrosanct fetish of today is science. Why don't you get some of your friends to go for the wooden-faced panjandrum, Is it not part of these institutions which must be swept away before the FP comes along?" Mr Verloc said nothing. He was afraid to open his lips lest a groan should escape him. "This is what you should try for. An attempt upon a crowned head or on the President is sensational enough in a way, but not so much as it used to be. It has entered into the general conception of the existence of all chiefs of state. It is almost conventional, especially since so many presidents have been assassinated. Now let us take an outrage upon, say, a church. Horrible enough at first sight, no doubt, and yet not so effective as a person of an ordinary mind might think. No matter how revolutionary or anarchist in inception, there would be fools enough to give such an outrage the character of a religious manifestation, and that would detract from the especial alarming significance we wish to give the act. A murderous attempt on a restaurant or theatre would suffer in the same way from a suggestion of non-political passion, the exasperation of a hungry man, an act of social revenge. All this is used up. It is no longer instructive as an objective lesson in a revolutionary anarchism. Every newspaper has ready-made phrases to explain such manifestations away. I am about to give you the philosophy of bomb-throwing from my point of view, from the point of view you pretend to have been serving for the last 11 years. I will try not to talk above your head. The sensibilities of the class you are attacking are soon blunted. Property seems to them an indestructible thing. You can't count upon their emotions of either pity or fear for very long. A bomb outrage, to have any influence upon the public opinion now, must go beyond the intention of vengeance or terrorism. It must be purely destructive. It must be that, and only that, beyond the faintest suspicion of any other object. You anarchists should make it clear that you are perfectly determined to make a clean sweep of the whole social creation. But how to get that appallingly absurd notion in the heads of the middle classes so that there should be no mistake? That is the question. By directing your blows at something outside the ordinary passions of humanity is the answer. Of course, there is art. A bomb in the National Gallery would make some noise, but it would not be serious enough. Art has never been their fetish. It is like the breaking of a few back windows in a man's house, whereas if you want to make him really sit up, you must try to let the roof raise. There will be some screaming, of course, but from whom? Artists, art critics, and such like, people of no account. Nobody minds what they say. But there is learning, science. Any imbecile that has got an income believes in that. He does not know why, but he believes in it matters somehow. It is a sacrosanct fetish. All the damn professors are radicals at heart. Let them know that their great panjandrum has got to go too, to make room for the future of the proletariat. A howl from all these intellectual idiots is bound to head forward the labours of the Milan Conference. They will be writing to the papers. Their indignation would be above suspicion, no material interests being openly at stake, and it will alarm every selfishness of the class which it should be impressed. They believe that in some mysterious way science is at the source of their material prosperity. They do. And the absurd ferocity of such a demonstration would affect them more profoundly than the mangling of a whole street or theatre full of their own kind. To that last they can always say, "Oh, it is mere class hate." But what is one to say to an act of destructive ferocity so absurd as to be incomprehensible, inexplicable, almost unthinkable, in fact, mad? Madness alone is truly terrifying, inasmuch as you cannot placate it either by threats, persuasion, or bribes. Moreover, I am a civilized man. I would never dream of directing you to organize a mere butchery, even if I expected the best results from it. But I wouldn't expect from a butchery the results I want. Murder is always with us. It is almost an institution. The demonstration must be against learning, science. But not every science will do. The attack must have all the shocking senselessness of gratuitous blasphemy. Since bombs are your means of expression, it would be really telling if one could throw a bomb into pure mathematics. But that is impossible. I have been trying to educate you. I have expounded to you the higher philosophy of your usefulness and suggested to you some serviceable arguments. The practical application of my teaching interests you mostly. But from the moment I have undertaken to interview you, I have also given some attention to the practical aspect of the question. What do you think of having a go at astronomy?" For some time already Mr. Verloc's immobility by the side of the armchair resembled a state of collapsed coma, a sort of passive insensibility interrupted by slight convulsive starts, such as may be observed in the domestic dog having a nightmare on the hearthrug. Mr. Verloc